Okay, as usual, I'm going to get us started, even though I know people will trickle in. I guess it's Stanford time. Um, it's been a pleasure to have our audience and our speakers this quarter. This is our last of our spring quarter seminar series on wildland fire policy and research. I want to acknowledge this series would not be possible without the support of the Woods Institute, Stanford Sustainability Data Science, as well as the Climate Energy Policy Program. This is a great way to round out the series because we're going to talk about Stanford today. I'm so pleased that our speaker today is Dr. Esther Cole Adelsheim. Esther is Stanford's Conservation Program Manager. In her role here at Stanford, she supports the university in land stewardship through conservation of protected species, restoration of local ecosystems, coordination of academic activities on university lands, land use planning, research, student mentorship, and she also teaches or guest lectures to the biology department and Stanford's Doerr School of Sustainability. She's also a member of Stanford's fuel management team, and in that capacity provides technical guidance on ecological stewardship and manages a few of the program's projects. She holds a PhD in ecology from UC Davis and is a recipient of both a Fulbright and NSF Bridge Fellowship. I think you'll be excited to hear about what Stanford's been doing and Esther's role in it, as well as others. And I'm going to turn over control to her. Looking forward to having her speak today. Thank you for your time, Esther.
Great. Thanks so much, Derek. So I'm going to try to successfully share my screen.
Got a great backdrop there. Nice. All right. And
All right. Can you see it?
there it goes. All right. You are good.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'm thank you so much for inviting me, Derek. It's a delight to be here. And first, I want to say that the work I'm presenting today reflects the efforts of a large team at Stanford, a talented consultant team, as well as our external partners, without whom the work would not have been possible. So, as Derek mentioned, my role within the Stanford's Fire Resilience team is really strongly related to ecological stewardship, and and in that capacity, I've helped implement some research projects and implement some of our biofuels reductions work, coordinate with researchers as well. So I'll offer some perspectives today about how Stanford has completed fire fuel management in a manner that aims to both steward native biodiversity as well as reduce fire risk. And in general, I hope you'll see evidence through this talk that the nature of our stewardship efforts have really been structured around learning, which is really the only way to approach this dynamic and changing environment that we all exist in today. So we've tried out some new tools and evaluated those outcomes through observation and through experimentation. So I feel we've learned a lot, and I feel the team as a whole is growing in its capacity to meet the reality that wildfire within our local ecosystems will occur within our lifetimes, likely at very regular intervals. So at this juncture, we really have the opportunity to influence what the outcomes of wildfire will look like for the people, animals, and plants that call Stanford home. So first, I'll review some of our recent history as a team. The Wildfire Resilience Group really emerged in response to the growing recognition that the lands at Stanford, like all lands in the American West, have a history of fire suppression that's led to the buildup of fire fuels, coupled with the understanding that changing climate is shifting the duration of fire season and the weather conditions when fires occur. So this combination of fire fuel accumulation and the changing climate is shifting the duration both of those things have contributed to changing the frequency and severity of fire. So we're pretty familiar with the Camp Fire, which in 2018 destroyed the town of Paradise, and in 2020 the fires in Napa County were similarly destructive. So within our local environment, we have seen those realities in our day to day. So the image to the left is an area at the Stanford Dish with a very dense grove of young oak trees, and the image to the right shows the Golden Gate Bridge, where the orange skies we experienced with those orange skies that we experienced following the Napa fires. So seeing this apocalyptic scene, as well as the dense growth in our woodland ecosystems locally, may have understandably triggered overreaction. But I'm glad to say Stanford's response to this growing threat of high fire severity was rapid, but it was also thoughtful. So in 2021, Stanford publicly released its wildfire management plan, which was designed under Stanford's guidance by our consultant team from Vibrant Planet. And this plan laid out really aggressive actions to reduce fire fuels in woodland and scrub plant community types based upon models of fire risk. So, really, how does one model fire risk? And there have been talks in the series about that to some degree, but really one can think about fire risk as a combined metric that incorporates the likelihood of a burn, the intensity of that burn, as well as the susceptibility of a given landscape feature to fire. So our consultant team helped Stanford think through fire risk and then modeled out those dimensions of fire risk on Stanford land. So here is an integrated hazard map that shows us a combined representation of both the likelihood of a burn in terms of the and the intensity of the burn in terms of flame length at a given location. So the consultant team used fire models that predicted fire behavior within a given parcel based upon the type, quantity, and arrangement of fuel in space. And they used simulation modeling in combination with this fire fuel modeling to estimate burn likelihood. But really, the potential for negative impacts of fire is really based upon the landscape features where the fire occurs. So the other critical piece of information that was used to shape Stanford's wildfire management plan is the location of high-value resource and assets across Stanford property. So these HVRAs may include structures, utility lines, cultural resources, recreational spaces, or biological resources. And Stanford staff defined whether fire at a given level of intensity would have a negative, positive, or neutral effect on any given asset. So as an example, we, the conservation program team, provided the input that we would expect nearly all the native biodiversity we steward to respond positively to moderate to low severity fire, but potentially negatively to high severity fire. Whereas the real estate office may have articulated that there are no suitable levels of fire intensity for research facilities or tenant housing. So all those responses to fire for all HVRAs were aggregated and then mapped as shown here, so indicating the relative susceptibility to fire. So it was, both the modeling of fire risk and its impact on Stanford resources that contributed to the development of the fire fuel treatment plan. So this plan involved reductions in standing fuel in woodland and scrub plant community types through tree thinning, removal of lower limbs, and mastication. We also plan to continue to maintain fire fuel breaks through a combination of old and relatively new methods. So many of these methods had not been tried at Stanford before, and none of them had been implemented at such a large scale. So we knew that large-scale reductions in standing fuel would introduce significant disturbance and potentially lead to negative impacts to biodiversity. So to minimize those impacts and to endeavor to understand the ecological dynamics at play within the fire fuel reductions work, the conservation program was responsible for a range of actions and activities. So we flagged exclusion and treatment zones. So exclusion zones occurred commonly within ephemeral wetlands or drainages, or to create patchy patterns of vegetation within the landscape. We flagged individual trees to cut or leave, active wood rats to nests to avoid. We worked with contractors on a variety of logistics, and seeded out native seed in disturbed areas, and created some monitoring plots. So the results of that study I'll review shortly. So if that sounds like a lot of micromanagement, it's because it really was. But actually, contractors were incredibly appreciative because they really wanted to do the job well. They wanted to keep Stanford happy. And oftentimes they lacked the ecological expertise that we were able to offer, just as I am certainly not qualified to operate a masticator, for example. So despite all this micromanaging, we still wanted to robustly test some of the assumptions that our combined efforts were minimizing the most negative outcomes we feared in terms of impacts to biodiversity. So in collaboration with Sheena Sidhu at Jasper Ridge, we created 30 by 30 meter control and treatment plots across Stanford property. We really focused on understanding impacts to the species clades that, by their existence, create habitat for a whole host of other species. We have limited time, we can't monitor everything, so we really focused on a subset of what one might monitor. Oak trees, for example, are at all stages of their lives are notable for creating habitats for other species, as are California ground squirrels. So California ground squirrels are industrious little creatures that compulsively dig out and clean their holes. This is a habit that's loathed by groundskeepers, but really critical for a whole host of native species, including several special status species that use the holes they create and also call Stanford home. So notably, these species include California tiger salamander and western burrowing owl. So, and we also wanted to examine closely the impact to nesting birds and dusky-footed wood rats. So I should say that consulting biologists were hired to survey for nesting birds, so that all fire fuel reduction work was completed outside the nesting bird season. So our questions were really directed towards, did the structural changes in the canopy change bird nesting behavior the spring following fire fuels treatments? And the same was true for our response that we were looking at from wood rat nesting behavior. So I'm going to show you a few before and after images of some of the experimental plots. And I'll also show you some pictures of the tools that were used, and see if you can predict what you think the outcome might be in terms of the results of our study. Again, we were looking for changes in the tree, small mammal, and bird communities in response to fire fuel reductions. So by far the most common tool used to reduce fire fuels at Stanford were chainsaws. Oops, I went too far. So we, the contractors were instructed to cut trees down to establish 10-foot spacing between them and to remove lower limbs up to 6 feet. So to some extent, these instructions were designed to reduce the likelihood of crown fires and tree mortality. So you can see a before and after treatment here. At one location at Stanford, there is actually a grove of trees that was planted to screen the then proposed location of the Reagan Library. So this was over 20 years ago, maybe I think over 30 years ago, and therefore the plants were planted very close together. So at that location, we used a large masticator with an giant articulating arm to masticate the trees from the top down. And in this case, we actually requested that they leave the stumps that you see in that after image because we hoped that those dead stumps would create habitat as a standing dead snag in the future. So finally, while the results that I'm going to present today, the study results, focus on woodlands, I also wanted to show you what some of our scrub plant community types looked like following mastication. So the image to the right, the after image, you can actually see where we masticated, and then downsloped a little bit, you can see one of our control plots. So this was a monitoring site for scrub plant communities. In general, across the board, there were dramatic changes in the structure of these habitats. So as a reminder, we created those, and what is shown in this image here is a 30 by 30 meter plot, and then we monitored a variety of biological variables before fire fuels treatments in 2023, and then after fire fuels treatments in 2024. So one of our first questions really was, what did the age structure of woodlands change as a result of treatments? So one fear that we had was perhaps there might be a temptation to remove only young trees or trees of a certain size class, thereby manipulating the age structure and impairing the long-term viability of that stand of trees. Luckily, it seems our compulsive flagging of trees preserved the age structure as it already existed in nature. The box plots here show that the distribution of size classes is the same between both treated and untreated areas. And then if we examine a histogram showing age classes and the frequency of those age classes, we see that while abundances across the board are lower in treated woodlands, which is what you would expect if you were thinning out a woodland, the shape of the curve is the same, indicating that there's really no difference in the relative of abundance of age classes. So next we wondered, would the treatments inflate or deflate the number of species or the abundance of one species relative to another? And again, we saw no change in tree species richness or evenness across the treated woodlands at Stanford. As I mentioned, the contribution of oaks in particular, but other tree species as well, to California ecosystems long outlasts their life. So luckily we saw no difference in the number of standing oak snags due to treatments. And similarly, we examined whether there was a change in the number of tree seedlings present. And there was also no difference between treated and untreated areas. We observed some interesting results with large woody debris. Notably, the large woody debris increased relative to untreated areas when we monitored them after fire fuels treatments. And we believe we can attribute this to the fact that as long as woody debris met a sufficiently large size class, we actually asked contractors not to cut the log or branch into smaller sections and leave a single log, or even better, a pile of logs near where the material was cut. In residential settings, large material that's cut is often chopped up or chipped, but we saw an opportunity to create some habitat features used by terrestrial salamanders, small mammals, lizards, and snakes, and a whole host of other native organisms. So moving on to small mammals, both the number of vole and California ground squirrel holes were lower 1 year following our treatments, but in both control and treatment plots. So it's not clear that they were responding to environmental changes caused by the fire fuels treatments. Instead, it's more suggestive that there's a year effect happening. So vole populations notoriously fluctuate widely by year, but California ground squirrels are not known for this population pattern. So really, we would need to collect longer term data to evaluate any real trends. And so next we looked at dusky-footed wood rats. There's some evidence within the literature more broadly that this species responds very poorly to fire fuels reductions. And indeed, we saw a marginally significant reduction in the number of active nests relative to the previous year's control. So not definitive, but suggestive of negative impacts. So all that being said, dusky-footed wood rats are hyperabundant locally, and we're not sure what their population looked like prior to fire suppression. Wood rats prefer densely wooded areas, and due to fire suppression, the habitat they prefer was likely less common in the past. We also looked at nesting behavior, but really we didn't have enough data to generate any real conclusions. Across our 36 monitoring plots, we only found 9 nests in total, 6 in the control plots, 3 in the treatment plots. So this is something to watch in the long term, but not extremely alarming. So in general, I think the take-home message from all of those monitoring efforts was that we documented change, but it was not change necessarily that seemed to threaten long-term persistence of any class of species that we looked at. But we certainly didn't measure everything. So there were undoubtedly negative impacts as well as positive impacts that we failed to measure. And here's an image documenting a qualitative benefit. In areas where we were concerned about soil disturbance, we seeded out native species. So pictured here is a location that responded particularly well with a gorgeous display of wildflowers. And again, this is not something that we actively monitored. So at this point, I like to return a bit to our fire risk models. So was it all worth it in terms of fire fuel risk reduction? Shown here is again the map of integrated fire hazard before and after fuels treatment. So where I'd like to draw your attention is the area in the red circle, which is where we perform the bulk of the fire fuel reduction work. So you'll see that the whole area has shifted into more blues and less oranges and reds. Blues indicate lower integrated hazard, and so that's really positive. It's meaningful, especially because this location is relatively close to campus housing and academic buildings. So, and it's also a hot spot for some of the special status species that I mentioned earlier. Species that could potentially benefit from low to medium severity fire, but would likely respond poorly to high severity fire. So that's a lot of information. I'll move on to presenting a few other projects shortly, but I thought I could pause briefly to answer a few questions. So if anybody thinks of anything, I guess, do people have the ability to unmute themselves?
They should. They should. If they're being
Okay.
shy, they can put something in the chat as well. Oh,
Okay,
Lincoln's
sure.
got his hand raised, he's polite, not shy, but very, very polite. So go ahead, Lincoln.
A very good description, not shy, but polite. I was curious about that age duration curve that you had for the trees, and it seems as though there's a very definite stopping point where, I mean, none of the trees are older than, I couldn't quite read the numbers, but say 50 years or
Lincoln,
something.
I'm having trouble hearing you a little bit. I don't know if that's shared by
Oh,
others.
oh,
Oh,
is this better?
that is much better.
Okay,
Yes.
I forgot to put the thing down. So I was looking at at these and now that I can really read it looks like none of the trees are older than about 50 years. And I wonder if there was some sort of major decision made back 50 years ago, what would that have been? 1975 or so. Was there a big planting or was there
Yeah,
some sort
well,
of
I'm
shift?
realizing that looking at this that I committed the a criminal act in that I did not label my axes. So that axis, the what you're seeing in those bins is diameter at breast height, and then the frequency
Oh,
at which that occurred is the y-axis. So
I thought it was years. I'm sorry.
yeah, no. So it's uh, so really, a 50 50 centimeter diameter breast height is really pretty big tree.
Yeah.
Um, and in terms of planting at the dish, um, there, yeah, there's sort of been a continuous level of a small amount of planting, I would say, since the 80s or so. Um, but and those trees might show up in that first bin.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So, but people are concerned about the persistence of oaks, and graphs, histograms like this. It all depends on where you draw the line in terms of how you bin
Hmm.
the plants. So I suspect if we zoomed in and subdivided that first bin, we would see the dynamic that most people are worried about in oak woodlands, that we have very few of that much smaller size class of oaks, and then so we're sort of failing to have oaks move from this smaller size class to larger size classes. And one reason that's
Oh,
cited for
okay.
that is heavy deer herbivory.
Okay.
So inflated deer populations that are not as controlled as they once were by mountain lions and our other large predators.
Yep. Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up question to clarify now that I'm looking at the plot. So if there is a number, right, and there's no bar on it, right, that means there still is an existence. So I see the 101.3, that's saying there's a really a meter diameter tree, at least one, I guess. And then it's just five small statistics, right? There's the treatment just didn't include, right? You guys didn't remove a meter diameter tree. It's just small statistics because of the control area versus the treatment area. Is that correct? Am I
Yeah, I
understanding it?
so this reflects the diameter at breast height of the remaining trees in control and treated woodlands. I think
Okay.
I don't know that I've ever seen an oak tree at the dish that's 100, like about a meter in diameter at breast height. That would be a
I'm
very
just wondering,
large
so
tree.
it
Yeah,
seems like it probably exists because
it probably
why would that
does.
number be
Yeah, I
there?
mean,
Why, that number's there. So anyway,
yeah, yeah. Right, it's on the graph, is what you're saying.
yeah,
Yeah, I don't remember. I'd have to look back
no
at the
worries. I don't
data
want to
to see.
sidetrack you.
Yeah,
It's just a
yeah.
curiosity question. Why don't you go
Yeah,
ahead?
yeah. And of course, this is a subset of all the trees. This is just what we're finding in these plots that where we did our monitoring efforts. So, is there anything else before I move on?
I think we're good. People can circle back
Okay.
to at the very end too.
Sure, yeah, as people think of things. So oops, I got too far. All right, so what I've been reviewing so far has really been focused on reductions of standing fuel, but we also worked to create these fire fuel breaks. So fire fuel breaks tend to be linear features, and their goal is really to alter fire behavior by lowering the intensity or the rate of spread of wildland fire. So in the past and into the present, Stanford's used mowing and disking and grazing to create fire fuel breaks. And in recent years, we've piloted some new methods using prescribed fire. Here at the West Ridge boundary between Stanford property and the town of Portola Valley at Jasper Ridge, there was a dense stand of chaparral, and you can still see that to the right of the image. To create The fire fuel break that you see here, that material was cut, it was piled and burned. And this incredible effort was led by Sheena Sidhu, pictured here to the right of the image. And the project on the whole generated a rich spectrum of benefits. In addition to fire fuels reduction, there was significant investment by the fire management team to reach out to neighbors, to get folks comfortable with fire, albeit good fire, essentially in their backyards. Stanford also worked with Indigenous students and the Mwakmaloni to celebrate Indigenous culture and supported participation and observation by students, faculty, and tribal members. And in addition, 13 research projects were initiated by Stanford students and researchers in association with the burns. So moving on to another type of prescribed fire, the burn bot. So as Lincoln has said before, the upside down toaster. So after we learned a little bit more about this technology, we thought there was some clear potential benefits to using a controlled burn chamber to create fire fuel breaks. So we initially designed a pilot effort to help us better understand, first, under what conditions could we create a viable fire fuel break using a controlled burn chamber. So we used it across variable slopes, soil moisture, surface conditions, etc. And then we also wanted to understand how might the plant community respond to these interventions. Could we reliably expect to see suppression of weedy species through the use of prescribed fire? So here's a short video showing what the first pilot effort involved. I think one of the more interesting pieces to pay attention to is how the BurnBot Blackliner actually works. As you'll see from the video, there are torches at the front of the unit that, as the unit moves forward, they ignite the fire fuels, and then as the unit drives along, there's water at the back of the unit that sprays the fire, and rollers at the back as well. So the water in combination with the rollers extinguishes the fire. And if that doesn't work or there's some emergency, there's also fire suppression tools on site. So there's firefighters, so you'll see them in the video in yellow. And then there's also a companion vehicle with a water tank and a hose as well. Not as visible in the video, but for your awareness, the unit contains and filters emissions through a series of fans and filters, which is the reason that air quality permits are not required for the operation of this BurnBot device in most jurisdictions. So here we go. So as you saw from the video, we burned the center line of the gravel road. So this is a location that tends to develop an overgrowth of weeds, as well as burning on the adjacent sides of the roads. The weeds grow, this is a gravel road, so that's why the weeds are able to establish and persist there. So our stewardship goals for the road were to reduce invasive weed coverage and fire fuel loads. In the road adjacent areas, we wanted to reduce invasive weed coverage, fire fuel loads, but we also hoped to promote native species. The burn bot completed a pilot burn in June of 2024, and then date is wrong, another in December of 2024. So for that first spring burn, it really did effectively create a fire fuel break, and it was able to navigate successfully through steep and variable terrain. So so the next step was, and why we burned in December of that year, is that we wanted to see if an early winter burn that would allow us to kill emerging non-native annuals might actually be a more effective means of creating fire fuel breaks and suppressing weeds. But unfortunately, the higher moisture levels in December made it more difficult for the burn bot to navigate through steep terrain, and it got stuck. So we did get it out, but getting the burn bot unstuck and the soil disturbance associated with that is not within acceptable levels of performance for creating these fire fuel breaks. So we ended up not only burning these sites, we ended up seeding them as well. We discovered through our pre-treatment monitoring that the entire site was dominated nearly exclusively by invasive non-native annuals. So annuals are plants that live and die in one season, and they have very shallow rooting structures. So we deemed it necessary to seed out native perennial plant seed in order to stabilize steep slopes in advance of the rainy season. Perennial plants have much more deeply rooted systems and are able to hold soils in place. This image is 3 members of our fire crew, myself included, with the broadcast seeders that we used to spread seed. We learned a lot from an operational standpoint, but we also wanted to understand plant community responses. So returning to our original question, we wondered if the summer burn reduced coverage of a particularly noxious weed common in roads and roadsides, Ditrichia graveolens. And we found a marginally significant decrease in Ditrichia coverage following the June burn. But this data is all hot off the press. We monitored plant coverage this past May. And at this time of the year, Ditrichia is really small. It's really only a basal rosette of leaves. Later in the year, sometime between August and October, the plant will grow up to its full size, as pictured here. The timing of the monitoring effort we believe to be the reason for the relatively small effect size, the small difference in coverage before and after the burn. So we'll monitor plant coverage again in October when we expect Ditrichia to be at its full size. And hopefully we'll see an even bigger difference and a quite significant one. So this is a good result in terms of the ability of the burn bot not just to reduce fire fuels in these fire break areas, but also to reduce weed coverage. In the road adjacent areas, we evaluated overall non-native coverage. We ended up seeing increases in non-native coverage in control plots in 2025 relative to 2024, whereas treated areas maintained the same level of non-native coverage. Within many contexts, control of non-natives is the goal. So really this outcome could be viewed as a success. My aim, of course, is to see some reductions in non-native coverage and increases in native coverage, which sometimes can only be achieved with time and repeat application of weed suppression measures. So in general, the effects of the burn bots seem positive. I'd be looking to understand those differences a little bit more clearly, and that will happen as we gather some more information and run more analyses over time. Another notable observation is that despite seeding in both the areas burned in June and the areas burned in December, we really only observed seeded species in the areas burned in December. So this is an interesting result that indicates potential for an early winter burn to better achieve restoration goals where navigation is possible. And what's coming is a more robust analysis focused on the comparisons between summer and fall burn. But if there's a real difference in native plant establishment, we think it might be due to the reductions in competition that result from killing the upcoming year of growth, whereas in the summer burn area, the seeds had to compete with these sprouting, already established annual seedlings. So we'll be using the BurnBot to burn things this coming June in a couple of weeks. And that pilot area will be reburned to help us continue to answer questions about plant community responses as we increase the number of repetitions of that treatment. So there's more to come. As I mentioned, the use of prescribed fire really sparked the interest of students and faculty researchers, or perhaps it just aligned with already existing areas of research. And since I've been focusing so heavily on the biotic component of our local ecosystems, I thought it would be helpful to highlight the work of a research group that is more focused on the abiotic environment, specifically air quality. Jessica Wu, a staff scientist at the Woods Institute, so maybe you all know her, and I think I saw her on the call, in collaboration with the Stanford Student Radio Club. They're interested in designing air quality sensors that are affordable and can function in remote environments where wildfires occur. To help refine their air quality sensor system, they deployed their sensors during both the pile burns and the BurnBot burns. So I'll just take the words out of her mouth. And she says, we know that good fire can help in part with preventing larger catastrophic wildfires, and we need to think about the public health impacts of the smoke, and that's going to come out of it. To do that, we need to think innovatively, collaborate with others, and this is one potential tool among many to help support that. Really, what they were attempting to address is a prohibitive challenge within this sector, common to many air quality sensors, and that is the need for a Wi-Fi connection. So the sensors created by Jessica and the Stanford Student Radio Club use radio waves instead of Wi-Fi, thereby reducing the amount of power needed and making real-time data transmission more reliable. And I'm happy to say that they weren't able to document any elevated levels of air pollution during the BurnBot burn. And significantly, the research team was able to compare their results with the air quality data collected through Stanford's N5 sensor network. So this network is used by Stanford and our fire professionals in the community to detect smoke and support rapid response. It's really exciting to see how the work by this research team is progressing and imagine how their work here at Stanford might help others beyond Stanford's property boundaries. So in general, the work I presented today represents the collaborative work of many people, many organizations. So here are the Stanford folks that are part of our fire resilience team, as well as our regional partners. It's a great pleasure to get to work with them all. And finally, I thought I'd leave you with this image because I think one of the major takeaways for me from the work that we've done is to just jump right in. One will never have perfect knowledge of the outcomes of our interventions. So all we can do is structure the work so that learning is embedded in workflows, and recognize that the cost of not taking action is higher than taking action and making mistakes. And really all we can do is our very best, which is, I believe, what many of our colleagues have done. So that's it.
That's fantastic, Esther. Thank you so much. And
Sure.
I'd like to open it up to questions. I have some, but I'd like to open it up to the audience. I can ask you anytime offline.
Okay, sure. Yeah. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing.
Yeah, if people can speak up, or if you're shy, you can go to chat, but if not, you can follow Lincoln's uh,
Lead to be bold.
lead to be bold. And there is Lincoln. He's leading to be bold, but very politely again. Go ahead, Lincoln. I assume that you're coming on not just to show us your beautiful face, but you're going to say something.
No, I was coming on just to support Esther. Actually, I just mostly I just want to give a shout out to the fire team. You featured that a little bit at the end here, and that's been such an exciting part of this to work with the burn bot, really see what that can do in the Stanford context. And in case folks don't know, those BurnBot demonstrations, pilot tests were also attended by Palo Alto Fire and Portola Valley and I think Cal Fire. And, it was a real great example of Stanford moving the needle in terms of knowledge, not just for itself, but for the surrounding community. So I wanted to give a big shout out to that. It was a really cool thing.
Absolutely. Esther did a great job, really just sharing that information and disseminating it to a broad audience. Yeah, there was also Santa Clara County Fire Safe Council. And yeah, there was the whole long list of people participated, and it was open uh, to see this amazing technology. Are there other questions from the audience? A lot of ground cover, a lot of amazing ground cover today by Esther, no pun intended.
Yeah, we've got our steps in.
Okay, I'm gonna ask one question. You know, I really appreciate the stewardship aspect, especially the first stuff you shared today, and then the pile burning. You talked about engaging the indigenous community. Has there been any engagement? I mean, I'm not sure if we have contacts with Moeka Ohlone in terms of indigenous practices of land stewardship, but has that been on the radar, at least of trying to think about some of the traditional practices that were used on this land for the last couple centuries?
Yeah,
Is that part of the thinking or process?
right. Yes. So, as Linda mentioned, I talked, about collective collaborative efforts pretty much throughout the talk, but through sort of the eyes of our group. But so I'll speak to something that Jasper Ridge, a bunch of people from Jasper Ridge are sort of partnering in part with Laura Jones as well, our campus archaeologist, who has worked very closely with Mark Maloney over the years, to think about whether there could be some capacity building for Mark Maloney, and thinking about cultural burns. But Mwakmola are very busy, and so it's you know and it's and a quite sad part of our story, and across the United States, is the loss of indigenous practice. And so and now I think many people are confronted with the desire and need, unfortunately, to relearn some of these practices. So that's where we're at. Stanford continues to maintain strong relationships with the Maloney, and I think everyone is in a process of discernment of what's possible and feasible and desirable for all parties. But yeah,
Yeah,
I think Maloney has applied for a CAL FIRE grant to achieve some of those objectives on Stanford property.
that'd be great to see what comes of that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Are there other questions from people? Again, I have a whole load of them, but I can talk to Esther anytime. I guess you guys can too, but are there other questions or comments? I guess, one thing, just really just complimenting what you guys are doing. And I'm hoping some of these things are published. I'm not sure that's where you make the most impact. I'm a scientist too, but it seems like a lot of these practices need to be disseminated to a broader audience because, Stanford has the freedom, thankfully, of having its own lands, but these things, the lessons learned here are broadly applicable. One thing that comes to mind, which I don't know how tricky it was for you guys, is reseeding, right? So my class had students looking into seed banks, and at least on a national level, seed banks are not diverse and they aren't targeted like what you were able to accomplish. So was that difficult? I guess maybe there's enough native species, so it wasn't hard to come by reseeding with the right species. And do you have, and this is putting you on the spot, do you have any recommendations for how to go about just restoration, even in the presence of a real wildfire? Because I think, from what I understood from our students that did a project, there is really a mixed bag in terms of history of how restoration happens after a fire. And it seems like reseeding is an important piece. And you're an ecologist, so that's why I'm putting you on the spot. What do you recommend? What do you think should be done after a fire? And should there be maybe some local or national seed banks that can at least bring things back, as
Yeah,
opposed to having invasive species take over and increase wildfire risk, which I'm opening another
right.
can of worms by saying that.
Yes, yeah, you covered a lot of ground with that question. So
Okay, sorry.
no, 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 it's okay. I'll try to endeavor to break it down a bit. And if I've forgotten a piece, please let me know. So when you said seed bank, I actually was not thinking of what's in production industrially, but actually what's existing in the soil already.
Mhm.
So in many cases, we found that with reintroduction of fire, we actually have a robust seed bank already. So fire can oftentimes, support the reemergence of species that we thought we had lost. And in fact, that happened in the pile burn area at Jasper Ridge. So yeah, so that's one seed bank we can rely on, and the viability of seeds is really long. Not for acorns actually.
Mhm.
They don't last very long, but for some types of seeds, it's decades if not. I think there's some that even have 100-year
Mhm.
sort of viability lifespans.
Mhm.
So in terms of seed in that's available commercially, locally, we actually have more choices than many places. But even those choices are limited. So it's not like you could just what's in nature is reflected as a perfect mirror in commercially available places. So it's a subset of species, and it's actually a subset of ecotypes, which is significant as well. So many people, and in fact, historically, within the field of restoration ecology, people were oftentimes looking to recreate what was there before. And so you would want to maintain the genetic structure and really have seeds that are very locally sourced. What the conservation program is thinking about, and I think probably the reality of many practitioners, is that under climate change, what exists historically may not
Yeah.
persist into the future. So we oftentimes take this shotgun approach, and that's I think especially appropriate in really heavily modified systems where you have almost no notion of what might persist well in that area. So we take a shotgun approach of both species and ecotypes as well occasionally. Or if our most local ecotype isn't available, maybe we'll pick one that's a little farther south. A Gilroy purple needlegrass instead of a Palo Alto purple needlegrass. Yeah, so I think we have found that seeding is really beneficial, and A lot of if you have high severity fire, or if you have a lot of disturbance associated with the fire fuels reductions, you are creating soil disturbance. And the things that love soil disturbance are weeds. And so when
Mhm.
you have, if you don't put something in quick, you're going to have weeds that come in quite quickly. And even still, you may have weeds depending on, where that site is and what the seed rain is for that given location.
One follow-up to your last comment. I'm sorry, I'm stealing all the audience time here. Is Do you think the burn bot caused less disturbance
Then the methods that
than
we
a?
have used,
Yeah.
certainly, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, with the exception of when we ran it in the winter. So,
Okay.
the
Yeah. Getting
soils
stuck in the
were,
mud
yeah,
obviously is
yes.
a big thing.
Yes. So anytime you get a big vehicle stuck, that causes some disturbance. Although I would say, you know, it was fine in the grand scheme of things, but not something we would want to have regularly occur. Um, so, uh, so yeah, the issues with our more recent historically used methods for creating fire fuel breaks are that when you mow, it's very difficult to get the timing right, and you aren't necessarily able to target weed suppression. So that is challenging. And if you're mowing during hot, dry conditions, you can actually start a fire,
Yeah.
which is problematic. The other method that has been used is disking, which creates a lot of disturbance. We have these, as I mentioned, those holes created by California ground squirrels. So when you disc over that a hole, then that habitat disappears, and that's significant for many of our native species. You also lose a lot of soil carbon, and it's hard to maintain native plant communities. So they tend to be places where you lose carbon, and then you have a bunch of weeds that come in because of that repeated turbation of the soil. The other methods that have been used are grazing by livestock, and that is also hard to get right. Unless you want to sort of obliterate everything, which goats are really good at, it's difficult. Yeah.
Wow. Well, I've learned a lot. Even though I've talked with you before, I've learned a lot today, and it's
Great.
challenging, but yet really important work. So again, thank you for your time today, Esther. Thanks for the audience for your participation this quarter, and curious to see where this goes in the days ahead. And I guess another burn bot date's coming up in a few weeks, so we'll see what comes from that. So thank you again for everyone's
Yeah.
attention. Thank you, Esther, for your time. Thank you for everyone joining us this quarter. We hope to do this again next year. Have a great rest of your day and end of spring quarter.
Bye-bye.